Okay, guys, I think we're gonna go ahead and get started. I'm pretty nervous to be here today. You see, the irony of me experiencing this is that I'm now doing the very thing I ask my own students to do 4 times every semester. Be vulnerable, take a risk, and advocate for something you believe in. As an oral communications teacher, I teach one of the classes kids seem to hate the most, public speaking. And according to the Washington Post, they aren't alone in their hatred. You see, public speaking ranks #1, averaging 25% of our population who say that speaking in front of a crowd is their greatest fear. Yet, here I am, not only teaching a class that kids seem to hate the most, but attaching words like graduation requirement to the amount of pressure they're already experiencing. Our district requires that each student present a 5-minute public speech in front of an audience, or you guessed it, they don't graduate. So as a way to rip the Band-Aid off, on the first day of class, I go through a quick but fairly thorough syllabus read-through. And as I look around, I am fairly certain that my students think that I sound more like Charlie Brown's teacher than the voice you hear today. I'm fairly certain my students only hear me say, wah, wah, stand in front of an audience for 5 minutes, or wah, wah, you don't graduate. Not exactly the best way to get student buy-in. During my first semester as an oral comm teacher, I soon recognized the lack of student excitement with these graduation requirements. Yet, for the most part, kids were writing speeches. I mean, graduation, after all, is important to them. Yet many weren't understanding the value or importance public speaking had on their lives. They weren't using this as an opportunity to speak up and ask for change. And almost every student loathes the idea of standing in front of a room. And each semester, there are a few students who walk into my room with walls up, completely separating themselves from me and any kind of consideration of standing in front of the room. These students, including a young man we'll call Isaac, was closed off and uninterested in what oral communication has to offer. As a freshman, Isaac was already overwhelmed from navigating his way around a large high school. And now, he had this perceived misfortune of his schedule including oral comm. He became habitually late to class, unwilling to participate. He was intentionally working not to get noticed, to just fly under the radar, just do his time. Something was missing. So in a constant swirl of reflection, I asked myself, what do I want these students to learn? What are the life skills I want my students to have? How do I build a foundational skill set that each student can benefit from? A way to gather and interpret data so that they can ask for an increase in their salary. A way to speak up in moments of injustice. Or the opportunity to feel like a valued member of a group. I thought about my own experiences. I reflected on the times where I didn't know how to speak up and ask for change. I thought about the value of research-based persuasion and what the real-world application of this skill looked like when combined with public speaking. But then, of course, the inevitable questions. What does this look like? I mean, what does that even mean? Because as humans, we only store information that we believe to have value. And when the majority of us enter a public speaking course fully believing that we will never become a public speaker, we simply condition ourselves to just survive the dreaded minutes in front of the room. And how do we get our students to feel comfortable taking the risk that allows themselves to advocate for the change they believe in, both in our classroom and in the days, months, and years following the graduation they're working so hard to achieve? Because let's be honest, people don't take risks in environments that they don't feel safe in. So as I continued asking myself, I thought about the times as a student where I found success in the skills that I was originally apprehensive to. What made the difference for me? And how do I recreate that in my own classroom? I kept going back to the way my graduate professor made 34 strangers feel like close friends after only meeting the week before. I thought about how many times in class I spoke with and sat by each of my classmates. I reflected on the interactive activities we engaged in, always walking into class knowing that we wouldn't be sitting long. I needed to recreate this culture. I desired a way to build relationships with all members of my classroom. I needed to build teacher to student and student to student connection. So recognizing this, it quickly became obvious as to what my goal needed to be. Build a connected classroom where all students feel comfortable advocating for something they believe in. But here we are again. I mean, what does that look like? Because what does that even mean? Because as teachers, we've read enough teacher blogs and sat in enough professional development sessions to know that building relationships with students isn't a new phenomenon. Yet connecting students to students was a strategy that I had never used before, at least not with intention or fidelity. Connection, as defined by Katie Stiles in The Importance of Connection, explains that connection is when two or more people interact with each other, and each person feels valued, seen, and heard. Connection doesn't need to be large or include hours of lesson planning. Connection can be small. A chat in the hallway with a student as they enter your classroom. A check-in when someone is visibly upset. Remembering that your student had to work the night before or that they were up late celebrating their mom's birthday. These types of interactions aren't new. Understanding who we teach is something, as educators, we do each day. But what happens when we take this a step further? When we begin to feel less like the familiar faces that we happen to see each day from 8:56 to 9:41, and we start to feel like a connected classroom, a place where each member feels valued, seen, and heard. Because human connection is a basic need. Connecting with others on a multitude of levels improves our health, lessens feelings of anxiety, fear, and loneliness, and in turn replaces these emotions with the sense of closeness and belonging. We need our students to feel connected, safe, and respected by all members of our classroom community. And most often, this isn't happening organically. Therefore, we need to figure out a way to develop this culture on purpose. The good news? Connection is a skill, one that can easily be learned and practiced. We can intentionally build small and frequent opportunities that bring our students together. Because relationships are tricky and not often sought after on their own. Because human connection is risky and requires vulnerability. And as our fear reminds us, reaching out to a peer in class or standing up in front of a group of similar-aged students sets us up for potential failure and ridicule. In developing a positive classroom climate, Jason Barr, an IDEA researcher, explains that students benefit from a connected classroom climate. The idea of a student connecting both with their instructor and with their peers improves student attendance, school satisfaction, and academic engagement. So where do we begin? Assessing your classroom climate culture can be done with personal reflection, or more formally, using the Connected Classroom Climate Inventory, a questionnaire created by a team at the University of Nebraska, Omaha, an analytical direction for your next steps. Using these tools, I began designing lessons and creating routines centered around the idea of building a connected classroom, an idea that is universal to all classrooms, not just ones that teach public speaking. So here are a few examples of what this looks like for me. Each day, as my students walk into my room, they're greeted with our agenda, our learning objectives, and a student-generated list of classroom norms. As the bell rings, I ask the students to complete a 5-minute warm-up activity where they write down our learning objectives, name an adjective that describes an emotion they're experiencing, as well as which of our student classroom norms they can commit to each day. Each day, this provides my students the opportunity for a sort of self-check-in to figure out where they are that day before committing to how they will contribute to our classroom environment. Each week, I plan a connection circle. A connection circle is a restorative practice that allows equal opportunity for each student to talk. I ask my students to stand in a physical circle around my room. Once they're standing, I always review our circle expectations, ensuring that I create a safe space for students to share. I then prepare up to 3 questions. These questions can be vulnerable, curriculum-related, or simple get-to-know-yous. I then use a talking piece as a way to symbolize that only one person speaks at a time. I like to use something fun, like a pirate's hat or a rubber chicken. Whoever has the talking piece does the talking. And when the student is finished, either after they've shared or simply if they'd like to pass, they move the talking piece to the person to their right. This continues all the way around the room until each student has had the opportunity to share. Additionally, each week I plan a connection activity because I have seen high school students squeal with delight with the simple placement of a scratch and sniff sticker on their graded paper. So imagine the joy they experience during an intense game of rock, paper, scissors, or from using hot potato as a way to learn each other's names. I use a life-size Jenga to review vocabulary, or a this or that activity, pairing students with something like mild or spicy salsa preferences, using small connections to create larger discussions. When grouping students, I always use some sort of equity activity. I want my students to feel comfortable talking to every member in our classroom. You can do this by using matching positive mantra or affirmation cards, from matching numbers or symbols on handouts before the student walks in, grouping them with playing cards. Be fun and creative. Ask the students to find the person with a birthday similar to theirs. Again, just creating a link of commonalities that the students may not know they have. Less formally, I work with intention to model daily check-ins, greet students by name, always striving for connection before curriculum. Last semester, I found myself constantly checking in with Isaac. For weeks, I received nothing but a grunt, and eventually, a pretty stern, just let me fail. Isaac had great attendance, but he was constantly asking to leave the room, an obvious desire to be anywhere but room 314. Yet, I just kept checking in. I'd ask Isaac about his day, his latest doodle, or the band on his t-shirt. I requested that Isaac join his selected small group to physically be present in our day's activities. I continued to invite Isaac into our class discussions, to hear his voice in our reflections, and to stand and engage in our connection circles. Most days, I was not successful. Yet, some days I was. Then one day, something changed. Scrolling through my email, I noticed a message from Isaac. How do I get my grade up? I want to pass. End of email. I requested that Isaac work one-on-one with me to make up the work he'd missed. And I insisted that he begin engaging with his peers, because connecting with me might be enough to get him to write a speech, but it wasn't going to be enough to get him to stand in front of his peers. Connecting Isaac with students who had similar interests or who struggled with different parts of our assignments supported him, slowly building his confidence. And Isaac started showing up, not just sitting in our small group or standing in our connection circle, but Isaac began to use his voice to project his ideas. Isaac was connecting. And while he was always a valued member of our classroom, he was finally an engaged contributor. Isaac presented his final speech on why we should advocate for victims of domestic violence. Additionally, in class, we heard confident speeches about changing the school starting time why we should continue to social distance after school, how to respect cultural practices that are different from our own. We heard controversial issues and heard one student defend her support of assisted suicide. But even more, several weeks after our final classroom time together, I began to see old classmates together in the hallway. And I heard stories of these students using their voice to speak up in other classes. Visible bursts of our connection leaking out into the hallways and into our greater community. Evidence of connection happening outside of our time together, outside of the safe space we created in room 314. We need to build relationships, to feel safe in a space that requires us to overcome a large fear, to use connection to create equity in safe spaces that allow our students to be their authentic selves and to grant themselves permission to change our world. Giving each student the power of connection far beyond their graduation day. Thank you.